The prairie had its own language, one stitched together by the whistle of dry winds through tall grasses and the creak of ancient wooden fences giving way under time's hand. Eleanor Whittaker had long since learned how to listen to it. At 29, she was as much a part of the landscape as the crooked oaks or the dust-worn trails that twisted like veins through the wild expanse of Willoughby County. Her clinic, if one could call it that, was little more than an old bunkhouse she'd converted with salvaged furniture and second-hand medical supplies. It sat at the farthest edge of town, away from the din of Main Street and the polished facades that had started cropping up as wealth trickled into the valley. Eleanor liked it that way. She liked her peace, her patience, and the slow, steady rhythm of life that demanded nothing from her but her hands and her heart. That evening the peace was shattered. A heavy knock rattled the door against its hinges. Eleanor looked up from her ledger, brow furrowed, the lamplight casting a soft halo around her figure. Before she could call out, the door swung open and Sheriff Danvers stepped inside, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the frame. His face was carved in lines of urgency. "Ellie," he said, using the name only those who remembered her as a child dared to use. "Got a man hurt bad, found him out near the Devil's Back Ridge." Without waiting for a reply, he motioned behind him and two deputies carried a man inside. Eleanor's breath hitched. Blood matted the stranger's shirt, a deep crimson staining the pale fabric. Dirt smeared across his jaw, and his hat, a battered thing that had clearly seen better days, was clenched tight in one of his hands even in unconsciousness. They laid him on the cot, and Eleanor was at his side in a heartbeat. Her world narrowed to the wound just beneath his ribs, the labored hitch of his breathing, the cold sweat beading on his forehead. "What happened?" she asked, already ripping gauze from a tin. "Don't know," Danvers said grimly. "Looks like he was shot. Robbery maybe, could be one of those drifters." Eleanor didn't waste time with theories. She worked with swift efficiency, cleaning the wound, stitching torn flesh with hands steady from years of practice. She didn't see a drifter. She saw a man hanging onto life by a thread, a man whose survival depended on her. It wasn't until the quiet hours of the night, after the sheriff had left and the lamps had been turned low, that Eleanor allowed herself a moment to study her patient. He was young, maybe early 30s, but there was a ruggedness to him that life had etched deep. His face, even slack with fevered sleep, held a strength that was almost startling. There was something else too, a kind of quiet authority that didn't match the battered clothes or the blood-stained boots. Eleanor shook the thought away. It didn't matter who he was. The only thing that mattered was bringing him back. She didn't know then that the man lying in her humble clinic was Nathaniel Cade, the elusive owner of half the land that stretched from Willoughby's southern hills to the northern riverbanks. And Nathaniel Cade, for all his wealth and influence, was about to find his world changed forever by the woman who had nothing to give but her heart and her healing hands. Nathaniel drifted between worlds for 3 days. Fever clawed at him, dragging him through memories and nightmares alike. His body fought against the infection creeping from the wound in his side, and more than once Eleanor feared she might lose him to it. She barely left his side. The world outside continued its slow churn, cattle lowed in the distance, the river sang its endless song against the stones. But inside the little clinic, time bent itself around the fragile pulse of one stubborn man. Eleanor wiped his forehead with cool cloths, coaxed spoonfuls of broth past his lips when he stirred, and whispered small encouragements he would never remember hearing. When Nathaniel finally opened his eyes, the morning sun was pushing weakly through the curtains. He blinked up at the ceiling, confusion etching his features. "Easy," Eleanor said softly, setting aside the book she had been pretending to read. She approached the bedside slowly, hands held where he could see them. "You're safe." He turned his head toward her, his gaze heavy, slow to focus. His voice was a rasp of gravel and exhaustion. "Where?" "You're in Willoughby County," she answered. "You were hurt. Sheriff Danvers found you and brought you here." Nathaniel tried to sit up and hissed in pain, his hand flying to his side. Eleanor pressed a firm but gentle hand to his shoulder. "You need to stay still. The stitches are holding, but just barely." He sagged back against the pillow, breathing hard through his nose. After a moment he looked at her again, this time with something sharper threading his gaze. "Who are you?" "My name's Eleanor Whittaker. I'm a nurse." Well, she amended, a small smile flickering over her mouth, as close to one as you'll find out here. Nathaniel studied her, and Alina had the odd sensation that he was weighing her somehow. She pushed a glass of water into his hand, helping him steady it. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, her voice turning businesslike. "You lost a lot of blood, infection set in, took a hell of a fight to pull you back." He managed a ghost of a smile, more a grimace than anything else. "Guess I owe you then." "You owe me nothing," Alina said, a little too quickly. She busied herself straightening the blanket around him, suddenly uncomfortable under the weight of his gratitude. Nathaniel watched her with a guarded expression, but he said nothing more. His eyelids drooped, heavy with exhaustion, and soon he was sleeping again. Over the next few days he grew stronger. Alina fed him what little she could spare, thin stews, fresh biscuits from her own kitchen, slices of apples from the orchard behind the clinic. She changed his dressings, monitored his fever, and when he was strong enough to sit up, she taught him how to move without tearing the wound open again. They spoke little at first. Nathaniel was a man of few words, and Alina had long ago learned the value of silence. But slowly, small conversations began to take root between them. She learned that he called himself Nate, that he had been riding near Devil's Back Ridge when he'd been shot, though he offered no explanation as to why. He spoke with a rough, measured cadence, like every word cost him something. Alina didn't press him for more. In Willoughby, secrets were as common as tumbleweeds, and she respected a man's right to keep his. What she didn't know was that Nathaniel was watching her just as closely. Watching the way she tucked her hair back with a careless hand when it fell into her face, the way she spoke to the old ranch dog who lazed by the fire as if he were an old friend. Watching the way her eyes softened when she thought no one was looking. And though he told himself it was just gratitude, just a passing moment born of weakness, something deeper had started to take root inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. One evening, as the first sharp hints of autumn threaded the air, Nathaniel shifted on the cot and said, "You live out here all alone." Alina glanced up from the fire she was tending. "Not much choice. Someone's got to look after the ones who can't make it into town." "You don't have family." She shook her head, "Not anymore." There was a beat of silence, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Nathaniel leaned back against the pillows, staring up at the dark beams of the ceiling. "Seems like a hard life." Alina stirred the embers, coaxing them to life. "It is, but it's honest." Honesty, the word settled in Nathaniel's chest like a stone. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him without some angle, some hidden expectation. He turned his head to look at her again, really look at her, and felt something in his carefully fortified heart shift. And Alina, feeling the weight of his gaze, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened. Neither of them said anything more that night. But something had begun. Something neither of them could yet name. Nathaniel's strength returned slowly, like a river swelling after a drought. By the second week, he could walk the short distance from the cot to the front porch, leaning heavily on an old cane Alina had carved from a broken fence post. He spent hours there, sitting on the steps, watching the land stretch out before him in all its quiet majesty. The fields rippled in the wind like an endless green sea. Horses grazed lazily by the fence, their tails flicking at invisible flies. A hawk circled high overhead, a dark sentinel against the blue. Alina kept herself busy with chores, but Nathaniel noticed how often she glanced toward him from the garden or the shed, as if reassuring herself he was still breathing. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. Nathaniel stood stubbornly at the edge of the porch, lining into the rising wind, until Alina came bustling out, her apron strings whipping behind her. "You'll catch your death," she scolded, grabbing his arm and steering him inside. Nathaniel chuckled low under his breath, but he let her guide him. The sound startled them both. It had been a long time since laughter had passed his lips, and longer still since it had been coaxed out so easily. The storm battered the little clinic for hours, rain pelting the windows and thunder rattling the panes. Alina lit every lamp she had and brought out an old deck of cards, dealing them between them with a crooked grin. Nathaniel hadn't played in years. The feel of the worn cards in his hands, the flicker of lamplight on Alina's face, the easy, teasing banter that sparked between them, it unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. By the time the storm tapered into a soft drizzle, he had lost every hand and was laughing into his sleeve like a boy at his first county fair. "You're terrible at this," Alina said, collecting the cards with a triumphant little shake of her head. Nathaniel leaned back in the chair, his body sore but his heart strangely light. "Maybe I just like watching you win," he said. The words hung there heavier than he intended. Alina looked up, meeting his eyes. For a heartbeat, the air between them tightened, charged with something fragile and new. But she only smiled, gentle and warm, and turned her attention to stacking the cards again. Nathaniel sat there, watching her hands move, wondering what it would be like to reach across the table and touch her fingers, wondering what it would be like to stay. The next morning, a horse and rider appeared on the horizon. Nathaniel spotted them first from his chair on the porch, and his jaw tightened as they approached. It was Levi Burrows, his foreman. Levi swung down from the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. He looked dusty, windblown, and furious. "Boss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His gaze darted to Alina, standing just inside the door, then back to Nathaniel. "We been looking for you for damn near 2 weeks, thought you were dead." Nathaniel shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of Alina's gaze on his back. He hadn't told her, hadn't even hinted. And now the truth stood there, saddle-worn and irrefutable. Levi continued, his voice low and urgent. "There's trouble, land disputes. Some of the smaller ranchers are stirring up talk, saying you've abandoned your claim. We need you back at the ranch, need you visible." Nathaniel scrubbed a hand over his jaw. He could feel Alina's confusion burning into him like the noonday sun. He turned slowly in his chair to face her. "I should have told you," he said, voice rough. "I'm Nathaniel Cade, Cade Holdings. I own the Barcy, most of Devil's Back Ridge, and a fair chunk of the county besides." Alina's face was unreadable. Nathaniel pushed himself to stand, bracing heavily on the cane. "I didn't tell you because here you didn't look at me like I was something to fear or to use. You just looked at me." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, Levi shifted his weight, uncomfortable, but made no move to interrupt. Alina finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "It wouldn't have changed how I treated you." Nathaniel believed her. He could see it in the open honesty of her eyes, the same honesty that had steadied his hands when fever racked his body. But he also saw the wall rising between them, a wall made not of lies but of truths unspoken. "I have to go," he said. "I owe it to the men who work for me, to the land itself, but I'll come back if you'll let me." Alina's hands twisted in the fabric of her apron. She nodded once, briskly, her throat working as if holding back words she wasn't ready to speak. Nathaniel stepped down from the porch and swung up into the saddle Levi offered him. He turned once, looking back. Alina stood framed in the doorway, small and fierce against the dying light. Nathaniel tipped his hat to her in a silent promise. Then he rode away, heart heavier than it had ever been when leaving anything behind. Fall deepened its hold on Willoughby County. The leaves on the scrub oaks turned brittle and golden, and the wind carried a sharper bite. Alina felt the change most in the empty spaces. The porch where Nathaniel had sat, the chair at the fireside, the quiet corners that once held his low, rough laughter. She told herself it was foolish to miss him. He had a life beyond these walls, responsibilities that weighed heavier than any wound. Yet there were mornings she woke expecting to hear the slow tread of his boots across the porch, only to find silence greeting her instead. The days wore on. She tended to her patients, broken bones, fevers, stubborn coughs that clung like burrs to the children of the valley. She kept her hands busy and her heart armored. In town, the talk of Nathaniel Cade's return spread quickly. Men who had whispered of his death now straightened their backs and lowered their voices in respect when his name was spoken. Alina heard it all from behind the quiet of her market stall, selling salves and tonics to the townsfolk who depended on her. You hear about Cade, Martha Sims said one morning, wagging her flour-dusted finger at a cluster of women. Rode into the county meeting like a storm, settled that land dispute in 5 minutes flat. Man didn't even break a sweat. They laughed and clucked in admiration, but Alina only smiled faintly and turned back to measuring herbs. He had returned to his world, and she remained in hers. She thought that would be the end of it. Until the letter came. It was delivered by a boy no older than 10, who stood on her porch shifting from foot to foot until she took the folded paper from his hand. No address, no signature, just her name written in a firm, unmistakable hand. Inside, the words were plain. I haven't forgotten. If you need me, send word to Bar C. Len. Alina pressed the letter to her chest for a long moment before tucking it safely into the wooden box, where she kept the few treasures of her life. She didn't send word she couldn't bring herself to. She told herself she didn't need anything. But life, as it often did, had other plans. 2 weeks later, a child was brought to her door in the dead of night. A boy from one of the tenant farms, burning with fever, his body racked with violent chills. His mother, frantic and near weeping, had ridden miles through the darkness to find Alina. Alina worked through the night, her hands moving with the fierce desperation of someone who knew too well how thin the line between life and death could be. But by dawn, it was clear she needed help. The boy needed stronger medicine, more supplies than she had on hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the letter once more, fingers trembling slightly. Before she could think herself out of it, she scrawled a note and pressed it into the hands of the same boy who had delivered Nathaniel's message weeks before. Ride fast, she told him. Tell them it's urgent. The day dragged, the boy's fever climbed. Alina refused to leave his side, sponging his forehead, whispering soft words into the burning air between them. It was nearly evening when the sound of hooves shattered the heavy silence. She rose, skirts swirling around her ankles, just as Nathaniel Cade burst through the door. He looked different now. No longer the wounded, broken man she had nursed back from death, but the full force of himself, broad-shouldered, sure-footed, with a determination in his eyes that stole her breath away. Behind him, 2 ranch hands carried supplies, fresh medicines, clean linens, even a crate of ice packed in straw. Nathaniel crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt by the cot, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he took in the boy's condition. "What do you need?" he asked simply. Alina swallowed hard. "I need time and help." "You have both," he said without hesitation. Together they worked through the night. Alina guided, Nathaniel followed. He boiled water, mixed tinctures, steadied the boy's thrashing body when the convulsions hit. He moved without complaint, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands steady even when hers began to tremble from exhaustion. When the first pale light of morning spilled through the windows, the fever broke. The boy slept, his small chest rising and falling in blessedly even breaths. Alina slumped back in her chair, her body sagging with relief. Nathaniel crouched beside her, his hand finding hers without thinking. For a long moment they simply sat there, breathing together in the fragile silence. Then Alina turned her head, meeting his gaze. "You came," she said, her voice raw with more than just fatigue. Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers. "I told you I would." He stood then, drawing her to her feet. His other hand, calloused and warm, brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The tenderness of the gesture undid her completely. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You have your world, your land, your people." Nathaniel shook his head slowly, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in a touch so reverent it felt like a vow. "My world doesn't mean a damn thing without you in it," he said. Alina closed her eyes against the flood of emotion rising inside her. She had spent so long building walls around herself, around her heart. But now, with him standing there, those walls crumbled like dust on the wind. The boy stirred in his sleep, a soft sound that brought them both back to the moment. Alina stepped back reluctantly, the spell between them fraying but not breaking. There would be time. There had to be. And for the first time in years, Alina believed it. Winter crept in slow and steady, frosting the fields in thin layers of white and turning the air crisp enough to bite. Life in Willoughby County bent to its rhythm. Hearth fires burned longer, livestock huddled close in the barns, and the river hardened at its edges. Aliner's clinic saw fewer injuries but harsher sicknesses. Nathaniel made it a point to ride out every few days, bringing supplies she hadn't asked for and news she pretended not to crave. Sometimes he stayed for an hour, sometimes for the night, sleeping in the chair by the fire when she insisted the cot was for patients only. Their relationship grew in the quiet spaces between duties. It was not rushed. It did not need grand declarations to give it weight. It was found instead in the way Nathaniel carried in the heavy water buckets without being asked, or the way Aliner saved the last of the fresh bread for him without comment. It was in the understanding looks shared over a boiling kettle, the comfortable silences that stretched long into the evening, the way her hand found the crook of his arm when they walked the frozen yard together. Nathaniel did not press her for more than she could give. Aliner, in turn, did not shrink from the space he made for her. Slowly, they wove something between them, as strong and enduring as the land itself. As Christmas approached, the town prepared in its simple way, candles in windows, wreaths of scrub pine on doors, a gathering at the church for hymns and stew shared by all. Aliner hadn't planned on going. Holidays had been lonely affairs for too many years, and she had made her peace with solitude. But on Christmas Eve, Nathaniel showed up with a horse saddled for her and a stubborn light in his eyes. "You're coming," he said simply, offering his hand. Aliner hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and together they rode into town beneath a sky dusted with stars. The church was aglow with candlelight, the small congregation singing with a rough earnestness that made up for any lack of polish. Children raced through the pews, women passed around steaming mugs of cider, and the old men played checkers by the stove. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was home. Aliner stood by Nathaniel's side, listening to the low hum of life around her, feeling his steady presence like a shield against the cold. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a visitor in her own life. Later, after the gathering had thinned and the night had deepened, Nathaniel led her to the small rise behind the church where the whole valley unfolded before them. The snow reflected the moonlight in a way that made the land seem almost otherworldly. Aliner drew her coat tighter around her, shivering not from cold but from the intensity of the moment. Nathaniel turned to her, his face half in shadow, half in light. "I built a house," he said, voice low and rough. "Up by the old cottonwood grove, started it after I got back, didn't know why at first, just knew I needed to." Aliner's breath caught in her throat. "It's almost finished," he continued. "Big enough for more than just me, maybe some dogs, maybe a family if the good Lord's willing." He took a step closer, his boots crunching softly in the snow. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," he said, "but I want you to know, when you're ready there's a place for you there, if you want it, if you want me." Aliner searched his face, finding nothing there but sincerity and a quiet kind of hope that broke something open inside her. She thought of all the lonely years, of the walls she had built stone by careful stone. She thought of the nights spent by sick beds, the mornings where the only voice she heard was her own. She thought of Nathaniel's hands, rough but careful, his voice steady even when she faltered, his presence a constant anchor. And she realized she was no longer afraid. Stepping forward, Aliner reached up and touched his face, her fingers trailing along the line of his jaw. Nathaniel caught her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, his breath warm against her chilled skin. "I'm tired of standing still," she whispered. "I want a life, I want you." Nathaniel exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. He gathered her close, wrapping his arms around her, holding her as if he meant to keep her safe from the whole world. She pressed her forehead to his chest, feeling the steady, sure beat of his heart beneath her palms. The snow fell softly around them, covering the scars of the past, blanketing the land in the promise of something new. In the quiet of that winter night, beneath the endless sky, Aliner Whittaker and Nathaniel Cade found the kind of beginning neither of them had dared to dream of. not built on grand gestures or sweeping romance, but on something far stronger: trust, healing, and the quiet, enduring power of love. And this time, they would not have to walk the long roads of life alone.